Good afternoon. Good evening, wherever you are. Today's topic of Stats Cafe is labor counts. Labor counts furnish framework to bring together labor market data from different available sources. Labor counts help produce a coherent and consistent set of aggregate labor market statistics. Labor counts provide various bridges between economic statistics and social statistics, between microdata from surveys and administrative data, and macro labor market data, as well as between human beings and money. They will also contribute to measuring well-being. Although labor counts are such important framework, they have not been matured or internationally standardized yet. Labor counts have not been applied in many countries, so discussion in international platform and knowledge and practices in countries will be useful to most statisticians and officials. In this regard, today's Stats Cafe will be fresh and fruitful to most participants. I hope it will improve your confidence to understand, design, or apply labor counts. Let's share ideas and find ways to boost labor counts together. Without further ado, let's get down to presentations, shall we? We are inviting cutting-edge speakers here. They will present various key elements necessary for understanding and compiling labor counts. After all presentations, I will keep time for questions and answers. If you find a question, please free to put it in the chat anytime during presentations. Nevertheless, please turn off your camera and mic, except for speakers, to make their presentation clearly highlighted. The first speaker is Mr. Kieran Walsh, Senior Statistician ILO. He will provide an overview of what labor counts are, their frameworks and methods, and how they complement existing labor statistics. You have the floor, Kieran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimizu. I will now share my screen and hopefully it will work well. So can people see my screen? Just a quick thumbs up from anyone. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to give a general background and some overview of ILO work of relevance to labor accounts. I think it's important to start the session with a quick problem statement. What problems are we trying to solve by having labor accounts? And these have already been mentioned in some way by Mr. Shimizu in his opening remarks. Well, the first big problem is that labor market data comes from various sources, and consequently, they are collected using different methodologies. So we can have different definitions applied, even for the same concept across different sources. We can be using different time periods, meaning that it's not easy to compare or to triangulate or bring that data together. we can have difference in coverage and target populations involved, all of which makes it difficult to compile together. And because we have surveys which will cover establishments, households, or individuals, and not just surveys, it will also be administrative sources, potentially big data. Another problem that we have is they're not typically compiled in a single place or comprehensive of all required data. So within any system, we can have multiple organizations or multiple departments within an organization who are producing labor-related statistics or have control of different sources, but they may not be compiled into a single place for more comprehensive analysis. And in addition, they won't necessarily be comprehensive of all the data that's actually required. So in other words, you might have a labor force survey, which covers a certain amount of information, but you might be missing data on earnings or detailed data on working time, perhaps, or vacancies, which is an important area of information. Another problem is that up to now, this is not, the need for labor accounts has not been recognized within the SNA framework, creating various problems. One of them is that there's a lack of clear linkage to other statistical domains. So these can be the SNA itself, or it could be, you know, education accounts, or it could be information on capital, whatever the case might be. The point is that because it's not recognized within the SNA, these linkages and this framework hasn't been properly developed and defined in a very clear way, creating difficulties both to compile them, but also then to have consistency in compilation across countries or over time. And I just referenced at the bottom a discussion document from 20 years ago now, actually 2002, which you can find on the ILO website, which describes some of the challenges and the benefits. It's called Labour Accounts, a Step Forward to a Coherent and Timely Description of the Labour Market. And while it is 20 years old, I think it's fair to say it's still a lot of the content is still relevant. So some examples of more specific problems that we face. Well, household surveys and establishment surveys differ in coverage. So depending on the country, you may have an establishment survey that doesn't cover small enterprises or the informal sector. So you'll have holes in coverage depending on which type of source you use. Different sources may apply different definitions of key concepts. So you may have an establishment survey which uses a definition of employment which is different than a labor force survey. Or you may have an administrative source which applies a definition of unemployment which is different from a labor force survey or a household survey. This can also be true of things like hours worked, payments, and so on. When we look specifically at administrative sources, ultimately they've normally been developed for other purposes. So they haven't been developed to produce statistics. They've been developed for an administrative reason, like to give out job-related benefits or unemployment-related benefits. And therefore, they often, one of the biggest problems is they won't use the same concepts. They'll use an administrative concept rather than a statistical concept. Another very specific problem is that you'll have different time periods in different sources. So you may have an establishment survey which is compiled across a year. You may have a labour force survey which is compiled quarterly, or you may have monthly surveys, or you may have administrative sources which are available weekly, all of which create some difficulty in reconciling or jointly analysing the data. A typically universal, I would say almost universal problem, is that no single source covers all relevant concepts or variables. It's difficult, to be honest, to imagine designing a source that would measure everything of interest, but that in itself obviously creates problems. And some countries ultimately have used labour accounts as a way to address these difficulties, trying to reconcile for all these different problems. So what does a labour account hope to achieve? This is a direct quote from a relatively recently published guidance note. The background here is that in the development of the new system of national accounts, which they hope to have agreed in 2025, a number of task teams were established on different topics, and one of them was in the area of well-being. And the task team published a guidance note on labour, human capital and education in 2021 for global consultation. And this guidance note is a precursor to including labour accounts within the SNA framework, or at least that's the intention. It produces guidance on how it could be included. And there's a link at the bottom. But what it says about what labour accounts hope to achieve is that labour accounts provide a conceptual framework through which existing labour market data from diverse sources can be confronted and integrated with the aim of producing a coherent and consistent set of labour market statistics. So the objective is to bring them together and try to produce something comprehensive and coherent on labour. So how does it do this? Well, it addresses data coherence by bringing together related labour statistics from multiple sources in a single set of tables, applying a consistent set of concepts across the data, making transparent adjustments to data to offset conceptual and scope differences, and making further informed and documented data adjustments to provide a balanced set of labour accounts. And when you hear from Manpreet and Noor in their presentations, these are the types of activities you're going to be hearing about: bringing the data together, applying consistent concepts, and then making adjustments to produce coherent and consistent data. And the other thing to note is each country that has developed labour accounts, and it's not a huge number, but it's growing over time, have adopted slightly different approaches. But importantly, there is generally a convergence towards the idea that we have four quadrants of tables. A quadrant that focuses on jobs, so fill jobs and job vacancies. A quadrant that focuses on persons, which would be employees and self-employed included. A quadrant that focuses on the volume of work done, which is hours worked, and a quadrant which focuses on payments, so labour costs, earnings, and so on. And that these four quadrants create the framework for a coherent and comprehensive set of data on labour. So the UN guidelines, as I just mentioned, propose four quadrants, and I believe this is consistent with the practice in Australia, which you'll hear about. So people, we'd be talking about things like the number of employed people, the number of unemployed people. In the case of jobs, we'd be talking about the number of fixed fill jobs, the number of vacancies. Volume of work is hours worked, volume of additional desired work, hours worked per job. So these would be statistics like that. And when it comes to payments, we're talking about total labour costs, compensation of employees, labour income from self-employment, payments per hour, these types of indicators. So that's the general idea of the coverage of a labour account. So there are a number of steps involved, and these are pretty consistently described in both the ILO note from 2002 and the more recent guidance note. The first big step is to define the desired output data. What is it you're looking to actually produce? And by now there's some consistency, as I said, in using these four domains or quadrants and a number of variables within those. Then you look to harmonize definitions across sources and adjust to achieve full coverage. So in other words, because you might have different concepts being used for employment or unemployment across sources, you need to undertake some steps to harmonize those, which might involve adjusting one of the sets of data to be consistent with the other. And also because you will have coverage differences. So let's imagine a labour force survey covering all people in the country, but an establishment survey which only covers enterprises of 5 or above. If you want to use both of them together, you need to adjust to try and achieve full coverage of both. Then there's a third step, which is adjusting for those conceptual and scope differences, and a fourth step, which is really at the analytical phase, and I'm sure Manpreet will talk more about this, where you do other balancing adjustments to really create a full account, much like is often done in national accounts, right? There are some sort of balancing adjustments done to make the framework consistent. So I now want to talk a bit about ILO work in this area that's relevant. So one of our key focuses is on the area of common definitions, because we believe this is a key issue across sources, which can lead to great difficulty in jointly analyzing data from different sources. There are at the moment different statistical standards in use across sources. So the 13th International Conference of Labour Statistics took place in 1982 and adopted a resolution including definitions of employment and unemployment in particular. And those definitions are still in use in many countries. However, in 2013, there was the 19th International Conference of Labour Statisticians, and it adopted a resolution with a wider definition of work, updated definitions of employment and unemployment, and a wider definition of the concept of labour underutilization. So that's extra indicators in addition to unemployment. And there are some important differences between those frameworks. For example, the 19th ICLS employment definition excludes some activities that were previously included in employment, for example, subsistence farming. And the idea with the 19th ICLS is that we now propose that some of these other activities should be separately measured. So it's not that they disappear, it's that we measure them separately so we can produce statistics on them, because they're quite distinct. There are different types of activities involved. In some countries, as a result of that definition change, there will be a substantial reduction in the employment estimate, particularly countries where there's a high level of subsistence activity. But there's also the need then to measure other forms of work. And different sources may not apply the same definitions or measure comprehensively. That's the ultimate point, is you may have one survey which relies on the 13th ICLS, another which relies on the 19th ICLS. So this is an important thing to take into account. We certainly promote the application of the new standards and provide support and guidance on that. But in doing so, we all have to recognize then that you might have different sources with different definitions potentially, and that needs to be accounted for when preparing a labour account. So some of the key standards, really the last three sets of ICLS resolutions are important. In the 18th ICLS in 2008, there was a resolution concerning the measurement of working time, and that is one of the quadrants of a labour account. The 19th ICLS provided the definitions on work, employment, and labour underutilization, and the 20th ICLS concerns statistics on work relationships. This would be status and employment, which is mentioned in some quadrants, for example, payments, where there's a separation between payments for employees and payment for self-employed. So the 20th ICLS is relevant there. The message really from all that is it should be attempted to apply the standards across sources, or if not possible, at least recognize the differences and consider what adjustments are needed. So LMIS is the last area I want to talk about, the labour market information system. This is something that the ILO promotes as a way to produce coherent information. And what is an LMIS? It's a network of institutions, persons, and information that have mutually recognized roles, agreements, and functions with respect to the production, storage, dissemination, and use of labour market information and outcomes, with the objective to maximize the potential for relevant policy application and program formulation and implementation. So there's certainly an overlap with the idea of a labour account. So it's about bringing different data sources together, trying to harmonize and make them coherent, but there's a different emphasis because there's, I suppose, a stronger link to policy application, policy and program formulation in the system. So there are four components in an LMIS. The first component is data collection, and here, very much like I discussed about a labor account, there's a recognition that no single data source will satisfy all your needs. And an LMIS, like a labor account, will use all available sources, but takes into account the strengths and limitations of each. And the use of labor statistics from different sources over time requires consistency in concepts, definitions, classifications, reference periods, and methodologies. So here you can very much see the overlap between the idea of a labor account and an LMIS. Consistency in data collection or harmonization is important for both purposes. Okay. Then the second component is the idea of a data repository, so some sort of IT system to store and compile the data in a consistent way. And there are various standards and guidance and tools that exist to support this purpose. Then the third component of an LMIS would be around analytical capacity. So we recognize that there are different levels of analysis that are needed. So there'll be a basic level, a second level, and a third level. The third level will typically involve projections of, for example, skills shortages or labor demand in the future. And we have to recognize then that we have different profiles required to achieve this analytical capacity. We need computers, we need the data, we need economists, sociologists, econometricians. So there are a range of profiles which might not all be present in an NSO, a National Statistical Office. And finally, the fourth component, which is very important, is the institutional arrangements and networks. So an LMIS recognizes that it's unlikely that an NSO can fulfill all these purposes. So we have to have institutional arrangements in place to support this. So implementing an LMIS, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. My point is there are a number of steps involved in implementing an LMIS. And our experience of supporting countries suggests it takes about 12 to 18 months on average. By the time you request assistance from ILO, if that's the way you're going to develop it, develop your MOU, and ultimately have an integrated LMIS up and running. That LMIS might be updated over time, expanded, and so on, but it would take 12 to 18 months to get something up and running. So my summary and conclusions, labor accounts offer a coherent framework to develop comprehensive data on labor across sources. That's the opportunity they offer. There are various steps involved. Achieving harmonization and transparent adjustments to reconcile differences is a key part of this process. You have to bring the data together and make efforts to make it coherent. International statistical standards and classifications are an important reference point in this process. Developing an LMIS and labor accounts will involve a number of overlapping activities, but ultimately they have different overall objectives and emphasis. But it's possible to do both, and there will be a lot of overlapping work if you do. The ILO offers support for the development of LMIS and the application of standards, and international practices, such as those you're now going to hear, are an excellent reference point for labor accounts. So I would invite you to pay attention and look for more detail on what countries are doing, like Australia and Malaysia. And the new SNA, it looks likely that they will include labor accounts, but the details are still under development. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful.
Thank you for splendid presentation, which overviewed fundamental elements on labor accounts. He highlighted gaps among data sources on labor statistics. Labor accounts thinking to address gaps. Labor market information system is also a tool to harmonize multiple data sources. He elaborated on 4 important parts: jobs, people, volume, and payments on labor accounts. This presentation was a really nice ice-breaking introduction to all, including those who are not familiar in this area. The second speaker is Mr. Manpreet Singh, Director, Business Statistics Futures Branch, Australian Bureau of Statistics. He has also contributed to training on labor accounts from ESCAP. He will describe Australia's experiences in producing a labor account. This will cover a brief overview of the frameworks, the methods used, benefits of labor accounts, and learnings. Floor is yours, Manpreet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sumisha, for the introduction. I'll just wait for Penia to bring up the slides. Yeah. While I wait, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, as was flagged, I will provide an overview of the Australian Labour Account, including the methods that have been developed, the benefits, and also highlight some of our learnings in developing the account as well. Yeah, thanks. Can we go to the next slide, please? The ABS Labour Statistics Program draws on from 4 key types of data sources or pillars of data, which provide complementary insights into the labour market. These are from household surveys, business surveys, administrative data sources, and the last pillar is the account compilation, which brings together data from separate business, household, and administrative sources to produce the Australian Labour Account. So basically, the underpinnings of the Australian Labour Account is based on these 4 pillars. Next slide, please. So the question is, why did we create a labour account in Australia? Okay, given the ABS already produces a wide range of labour statistics, either on a quarterly, monthly, or annual, or alternative frequencies. So the question is regarding why did we have to go down this path? I think even though we produce a wide range of statistics, the results from these various data sources do produce different results. Each have their own strengths and weaknesses. As an example, this chart shows estimates of filled jobs as at March 2022, which have been sourced primarily from either the business surveys or the household surveys. In each case, adjustments have been made to conceptually align the scope to that of the national accounts. And as can be seen in the chart, despite these adjustments, the differences remain between the estimates that we get from the business versus the household surveys. And in some cases, the differences are quite large. Most notably, the estimates of employment in the administrative and support services industry is far higher when sourced from business services than from households. This difference is thought to be due to the underestimation of workers employed through the labour hire agencies in this industry in the household survey side. So I think this illustration provides a clear articulation of the need for the labour account being developed in Australia's case. When we initially started looking at this in 2015, our users were asking us, what is the information coming from the household side versus the business side? And how should they be interpreting the statistical information from those 2 sources? So given there was questions being flagged, we started to look at how best to address this issue in terms of providing some insights that our users are able to make some informed decisions in terms of it from a policy point of view. Next slide, please. As flagged, as well as business and household survey data, the ABS also produces a number of outputs from administrative data sources. Forming a coherent picture of the labor market from all these data sources can be challenging, and this is where the labor account can help. Next slide, please. The labor account framework draws on the various strengths of the various data sources as inputs. As mentioned by Kieran, the results is an internally consistent set of balanced labor market information, which is conceptually aligned with the national accounts, as well as providing a coherent picture of the labor market. Using the labor account hours work series as an input into the national accounts has also led to improved estimates, such as GDP per hour worked or unit cost of labor. So from an Australian's point of view, in terms of addressing the initial question that was flagged by our external users, we've looked into the labor account actually being not only able to provide a coherent picture of the labor market, there's some lot of beneficial flow on into the national accounts as well, which I'll cover in my upcoming slides. Next slide, please. I should emphasize, which was highlighted by Kieran already, the framework for a labor account will depend on the country's available data sources and the policy needs. The Australian labour account consists of 4 distinct focus areas, and they include people, jobs, hours, and payments. These 4 focus areas describe a cross-sectional labour account involving the confrontation and reconciliation of key labour market measures, which I'll talk about later in my presentation. It's also important to note that these 4 focus areas are considered the primary components of the labour market, but it's also acknowledged aspects such as trade union membership may also be important depending on the policy imperatives within a national context. So from an Australian's point of view, these 4 focus areas were able to meet our requirements, but we do acknowledge, depending on your national context, that you might have to think about other focus areas depending on the data gaps or the policy need questions that you're trying to answer. Next slide, please. Okay. When you look at the people focus area, provides statistics on people in the labor market, such as those employed, unemployed, and underemployed. Data is mainly sourced from the labor force survey. The jobs focus area describes the number of jobs. This can include details such as the number of filled jobs and vacant jobs. Data is mainly sourced from establishment surveys. Plus, you can also get information from administrative data sets. In terms of the hours focused area, it describes a relationship between the hours of labor supplied by workers and hours paid by establishments. This focus area has a direct link to national accounts and productivity statistics via the hours worked estimates. Hours worked data is primarily sourced from the labor force survey, while hours paid data is mainly sourced from the establishment survey side. And the last focus area is the payments focus area, which describes the relationship between the cost of labor to establishments and the income received by workers from employment. The data for this area are mainly sourced from the national accounts directly. Next slide, please. So how do we go about compiling the labor account? Kieran went through the 4 steps of the compilation process that the International Labour Organization articulated, and the ABS has actually followed that in terms of developing the labor account. So I'll just go through the various steps and illustrate some key aspects under each of them now. So the first step is to take a stock take of your available data sources. This includes looking at your household survey data, business survey data, census data, various administrative data sets that are available in other government agencies or in the private sector. So it's basically trying to scavenge as much data sets that are available to answer the policy question that you are trying to address. The next step is devising the labor account framework is defining the identity equations. And this is really critical in terms of developing the labor account. So you look at your source data and you identify the relationship that should hold between the data. For example, the hours actually worked plus hours sought but not worked gives the available hours of labor supply. You will need to consider which outputs and therefore which identity equations to include in your model. This will need to take into account your country's policy needs and how your labor account will be used in terms of addressing the data gaps. So in terms of the framework, it's really critical to have a good understanding of the data sources that are available, not only within the NSO, but also what's available in other government or private agencies that can be used as inputs in developing the labor account. And then also being aware of the identity equations in terms of the data gap policy needs that need to be addressed. Next slide, please. This slide shows the identity relationships across the 4 focus areas of the Australian labour account. I wouldn't go through all of them today, but I will, however, highlight a couple of things. The first one is that some of these equations, such as average cost of labour per hour worked, draws on more than 2 or more focus areas. The other point is the identity equations defining the labour account framework will vary from country to country, depending on data availability and what policy needs are to be addressed. So I think the key message is that in the Australia's context, we had the data available to actually develop a comprehensive labour account across the 4 focus areas. But that doesn't mean to say that every country has to go down this path. The key aspect is making sure that you understand what the policy need is for having a labour account. You understand what the data gaps are, and then being able to determine whether the labour account is actually the right fit to address those issues. And that comes down to the fundamental issue of understanding the requirements and what is feasible from a data source point of view. Next slide, please. So the next step is in relation to harmonizing the definitions, classifications, and the scope of the data from the source statistics. This may involve using supplementary data sources and modeling to fill coverage gaps. For example, this will require very detailed knowledge of your source data, scope, concepts, and methods. You need to make sure you consider how your modeling will perform in unusual and unexpected circumstances, such as time of rapid change in the labor market, for example, during the COVID-19 period. After you've actually harmonized your definitions, classifications, and scope, then you can move on to the balancing part of the developing the labor account. This step ensures the data within the labor account is internally consistent across the 4 focus areas. It also seeks to minimize measurement error in our source data through data confrontation and drawing on individual strengths of various data sets. If you recall our 2 differing sources of employment estimates from the beginning of my presentation, this is a step that aligns those into one set of coherent estimates. So the balancing part is basically where you ensure that you're able to explain the statistical strengths of the various sources and make some decisions about how to ensure that the inputs are coherent from a balancing aspect. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of having a labor account? I think from Australia's context, the labor account has been very beneficial in addressing a number of key aspects. The first one is that it provides a framework through which existing labor market data from different sources can be confronted and integrated with the aim of producing a coherent and consistent picture of the labor market. It also helps users make sense of seemingly inconsistent labor-related data, which are often based on different reference periods, populations, definitions, and methodologies. So you're basically trying to do the work for the users in addressing those differences and putting it on a coherent framework through the labor account. The labor account can also provide new insights in terms of estimates of the number of people employed, jobs, hours worked, and income over time for each industry, which in Australia's case wasn't previously available at the industry level. The labor account also aims to provide a set of labor statistics that is consistent with the concepts, definitions, and scope of the system of national accounts. I should emphasize here that A labor account is meant to be a complement to, not a replacement for, the existing suite of labor statistics that are available internationally. And I think that's very important to emphasize, that developing a labor account does not mean that you can stop running your labor force survey, for example. The labor account actually provides additional information that complements but not replaces the existing suite of high quality labor statistics that are released internationally. And that's a key point that I just want to emphasize at this point. Next slide, please. Up until now, I've just been trying to give you a little bit of a framework of what the methods are and some of the nuances in terms of developing a labor account. So what does that look like in practice in terms of trying to implement the methods? So I'll just quickly spend a few minutes just giving you some examples of what we've done in developing the labor account in the Australian context. So here is an example of the identity equation for the jobs focus area. Total jobs are equal to filled jobs plus vacant jobs. Filled jobs are jobs that are currently filled by any worker. Vacant jobs are jobs that are not filled, but where the employer has taken concrete steps to find a suitable person to carry out the role. For example, a business may have advertised the position online, but not yet found the right employee to undertake the role. From this identity equation, we can expand on this to create another output, the proportion of jobs that are vacant. Next slide, please. Thank you. Both filled jobs and vacant jobs are available from existing ABS survey data. However, they are not produced with the same scope. For example, the Labour Force Survey is the best source for a count of filled jobs at the Australia level, but it excludes some populations such as short-term non-resident workers, and the industry breakdown in the Labour Force Survey is lesser in terms of quality to that we get from the business surveys. We also have a job vacancy survey that the ABS runs that produces counts of job vacancies, but it excludes the agricultural, forestry, and fishing industry. So this means that we cannot directly compare the Labour Force Survey information with the job vacancy survey information we are getting. Next slide, please. Yep. As mentioned, the ABS, collects data on job vacancies, but not for the whole of Australia population, because the agricultural, forestry, and fishing industry is excluded. The labor account uses externally sourced data on job advertisements, which are available to estimate the vacancies in this missing industry. So this is an example. We have used external administrative data set that is available to fill in a missing gap in terms of the agricultural, forestry, and fishing industry, which is out of scope of the job vacancy survey. We know that the Labour Force Survey provides the best measure of total filled jobs at the Australia level. But again, this needs to be adjusted to account for jobs missing from the scope. For example, jobs held by short-term non-residents or permanent Defence Force personnel. We also use information from business surveys to improve the breakdown of filled jobs to industry level estimates. So again, we're just building up the narrative, building up the picture within the jobs quadrant to the identity equations that were previously articulated. Can we move to the next slide, please? So after making those adjustments, we have conceptually aligned estimates of filled jobs, vacant jobs, and total jobs. From here, we can calculate the proportion of all jobs that are vacant. Here is a chart of vacant jobs as a proportion of all jobs over time. As you can see, there was a steep drop during the COVID-19 period. However, since then, the proportion has been climbing quite rapidly since then and is now at 2.9%. This recent rise in the proportion of vacant jobs has been occurring alongside a large fall in unemployment in Australia. Next slide, please. Okay. Here is another example of a use case for the labour account in providing a better insights into the patterns of multiple job holdings. Information on the number of people holding multiple jobs is available from the Labour Force Survey. However, industry is only collected for main jobs, as we all know. The industry of other jobs worked is not collected in this survey. This means that there's no information from the Labour Force Survey on the industry of secondary jobs. Secondary jobs and multiple job holdings became of particular interest during the COVID-19 period. In the first half of 2020, huge losses in jobs were seen in industries particularly hit due to shutdowns, such as in accommodation and food services industry and the retail trade industry in Australia. These industries are well known to have high rates of part-time or casual workers in Australia. This raised the question for our policymakers: how many of these jobs in these industries are held by people with multiple jobs? So this became a policy question during that time in Australia. The Labour Account estimates the industry of secondary jobs using data from the linked employer-employee database that we've actually been collecting and releasing and publishing for a number of years already. This provides an improved picture of multiple job holdings and secondary jobs. While not perfect, particularly during times of large labor market changes, as we observed during the COVID period, these estimates from the linked employer-employee database do help provide insights into the pattern of secondary jobs holdings by industry. So this chart shows the number of employed people in Australia over time with the light blue line against percentage changes in the number of multiple job holders. You can see a very large percentage drop in the number of people holding multiple jobs in March 2022 quarter. It's also worthwhile noting that the proportion of people holding more than one job has risen from 5.9% 2 years ago, just before the COVID-19 period, to 6.4% now. By industry, the rate of multiple job holdings currently range from 3.5% in the electricity, gas and water and waste services industry to 8.5% in the arts and recreation services industry. Okay. This is an example, at the Australia level, we can produce similar charts for each of the industry divisions as well. Next slide, please. Okay. This chart shows the estimated main and secondary jobs from the Labour Account by industry. As you can see, there are large differences between industries, as we would expect. Mining, for example, has very few secondary jobs, while other industries such as the education and training have a much larger number of secondary jobs. This chart shows that the estimated main and secondary jobs from the Labour Account by industry has various disparate differences across the industries. And a couple of highlights are that the mining and electricity, gas, water and waste services, for example, have very few secondary jobs at only about 2%. In comparison, the administrative and support services, as I've flagged previously, 13% of all field jobs are secondary jobs. So having this information is very useful for government and other stakeholders in developing policies based on sound statistical data to help ensure that resources and funding can be directed in the right areas as they are needed within the current economic climate. So this is just illustrating that the value of the Labour Account in terms of providing additional insights without actually having to run expensive surveys or collections. You can actually be able to utilize the information currently available to provide some insights. And especially trying to differentiate between main and secondary job has been very vital, especially during the COVID period in Australia. And having the Labour Account actually helped facilitate answering some of the policy questions in a very timely manner. Can we go to the next slide? So what were some of the lessons learned from not only developing the Labour Account, but also being able to produce the Labour Account since 2017? Australia initially started with releasing an annual Labour Account, and then we moved on to releasing a quarterly Labour Account as well. So we've now got quarterly Labour Account, and we also release an annual Labour Account as well. So some of the key lessons learned is that substantial time and resources were invested in devising the framework and methods. And a couple of points which I think Kieran has also highlighted is that no one-size-fits-all approach can be adopted. It all depends on the data sources available within the country level and what is the policy questions you're trying to answer. And I think it's really important that the effort that is required in terms of setting up the framework and the methods that will be adopted is very resource intensive. So having a clear articulation of what are the data gaps and what is the need for a labor account being clearly articulated and being explicit up front will ensure that the right resources are being dedicated and allocated. I think the other one is that because the labor account is based on a number of assumptions, so when there's rapid changes in the economy, which we observed during the COVID-19 period, there was some difficulties in terms of some of our assumptions that were previously made. So it's really important to be mindful of that and being able to be explicitly clear in your documentation in terms of what assumptions have been made in compiling the labor account, so that when users are making informed decisions, they have a full and clear transparency in terms of the underlying assumptions that have been made in the development of the account. The other key aspect is that because it's a multi-source design and we're relying on a lot of inputs, it's really important to ensure that if there's a heavy reliance on administrative data, that those data sets will be available in the future, especially when national statistical offices don't have much control over that aspect. So you have to be very mindful in terms of the administrative data sets that are used and the future requirements of that continuing to be available and being able to be provided. So there are also benefits, but there's also risks and challenges in that space as well. And next slide, please. I think finding the right balance is really important in terms of detailed output versus robustness, because the framework is based on a lot of assumptions and relying on a lot of inputs. The final level you go to, there is some, you could say, robustness issues that come in. So being very clear about what level of outputs are robust enough to release versus what can and can't be released from a labor account in the development part or the design part is really critical. It's also probably worthwhile highlighting that it's important to revisit the benefits and reviewing the models and the methods. As I mentioned, the COVID-19 period, did raise a few questions in terms of some of the assumptions we have made in the modeling. So one of the learnings is making sure that the methods and models are reviewed regularly to ensure that they're still meeting the current economic conditions, but more importantly are robust enough, and any changes that are made, that they're clearly articulated in your publication, so that the users are fully aware of the underlying changes to methods that could be driving their statistics. And the last point I want to just emphasize is that it's really important to explain the value of the labor account, because when we initially put it out, we put it out as an annual release. We undertook a lot of user consultation with our users to make sure they understood what the data was showing, that it's a complement to what the existing suite of labor statistics the ABS is putting out, and how does that add value to our stakeholders' models in terms of macro or micro analysis that they undertake. And that did require a lot of engagement. So I would say that as part of developing the labor account, it's not only about just putting something on the website and disseminating the statistics, but also having an agreed plan in terms of how to educate your users in what the account is showing, what the value add is, and also what are some of the the drawbacks of having that account as well. What are some of the assumptions that are underpinning this? And so I think it's really important to not lose sight of the explaining part and educating the users. So in summary, I would say that developing a labor account offers a framework to bring together labor market data from multiple statistical sources into a coherent and consistent set of labor statistics. The labor account, aims to produce labor statistics that are, in terms of concepts, definition, scope, which is consistent with the system of national accounts. As Kiran mentioned, there are currently no international standards regarding the production of the labor account. However, a 4-step process has been documented by the ILO, which the ABS used as a starting base. I would also note that the Australian labor account is probably the most comprehensive labor account currently produced. Labor accounts have also been compiled in other countries, including Denmark, Switzerland, and Netherlands. And Malaysia is in the process of developing one as well. And we've got a presentation from them very shortly. And I'll finish off by emphasizing again that the labor account is a complement to, not a replacement to the existing suite of labor market statistics that are internationally available. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you for a very clear picture of labor counts. He showed the benefits of putting together multiple data sources from practices in Australia, especially homing in on field and vacant jobs. I realized the pandemic has provided the challenges to labor counts through unusual conditions. The third speaker is Dr. Greg Jaco, Policy Director, Labor Market and Fiscal for the Center for Future Work. Unfortunately, he's absent from the cafe with contingency, but shared his presentation file, which will be uploaded on the website. In his presentation, the impact to convert labor forces to financial outputs is well informed. The outputs added up to outcomes by being introduced in policies. Also, I realized that the job vacancies are different between pre and under pandemic in Australia. I also understood the significance of measuring secondary jobs. Some points of his presentation were kindly explained by Manpreet. Thank you. The final speaker is Ms. Noor Rairi Maud Ali Khan, Principal Assistant Director, Malaysian Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Statistics, Malaysia. She will share Malaysia's perspective on developing and compiling a labor count. Please have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Shimizu, fellow speakers from the IO and ABS, and ladies and gentlemen. Let me share my slide. I hope everybody is able to see the slides. Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity for Malaysia to share some thoughts on the development of labor account in this country. Right. Basically, my presentation will focus on three areas, which are some background on labor market statistics in Malaysia, issues and challenges in the analysis and interpretation of these statistics, and the work in developing labor account for Malaysia. Right. So basically, the production of labor statistics in the country is basically anchored by the global agenda. As we shifted from the Millennium Development Goals to a more comprehensive and granular targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, entailed for a more granular and higher frequency labor market indicators. At the national level, this is aligned with the medium and long-term national plans in the country. And the most recent 5-year plan launch was the 12th Malaysia Plan, which encompasses the period of 2021 to 2025. This is part of a longer-term agenda of Shared Prosperity Vision 2030. So basically, the agenda related to labor market is outlined in Policy Enabler 1, Developing Future Talent, which is focused on realigning the labor market for inclusive and sustainable growth, as well as developing future-ready talent through increasing job opportunities, achieving equitable CE, composition of employees, improving labor participation, and strengthening labor market support. And through a longer term effort is to create high paying jobs, increasing labor participation and increasing skilled workers and effective workforce. In the short
Sorry
term,
for interrupting. Could you please share your presentation again? We are not able to see.
I see. Right. I'm sorry. I'll do it again. Can everybody see the slide?
Not yet, Nora. No.
I see.
I can help share the screen.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Right, we are now on slide 4. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the inconvenience caused. So basically, I was talking about aligning the production of labor statistics in the country with global and national agenda. As you may see, these are some of the things that we talk about, which is the focus in the country is to realign the labor market through developing future-ready talent, increasing job opportunities, achieving equitable compensation of employees, improving labor participation, and strengthening labor market support. And this is followed by this is part of a longer term national plan, which is shared prosperity vision. In the short term, as we face various economic challenges since 2020 due to the global public health crisis, a more immediate and short-term solutions have also been engineered, such as national recovery plans and a short-term national budget. So next slide, please. So as we know, as has been shared for Malaysia, multiple sources of labor statistics has been produced in our country, relying heavily in 3 major sources, namely household establishment as well as administrative records and big data. So basically, mainly most of the data come from household surveys. The one I highlighted with a bold font, which is in black, a thicker font, is actually the most used item in producing labor statistic. However, we do go back and draw to population and housing census, household income, expenditure, and basic amenity surveys. And from our labor force survey, we have supplementary modules such as informal sector workforce survey and salaries and wages survey. In terms of establishment, we rely most from quarterly employment statistics, but we also have economic census, annual economic survey, quarterly survey of services, and monthly manufacturing survey. And from administrative records and big data, these are some of the but not exhaustive of, is Social Security Organization, Employees Provident Fund, Inland Revenue Board with their tax data, and then Immigration Department, which offer information of non-citizens coming into the country. And then we have online job portals and job market insights. So can we move to the next slide, please? Right. Production of these statistics either from single source or by combining multiple data sources, we have managed to produce various labor market statistics. Most produced statistics is actually from labor supply statistics, which is the labor force data. Labor force data comes at the most frequent interval, which is every month. The latest statistics for April 2022 was published on, in fact, on 9 June 2022, and the next one will come early July, which is in the 9th of July 2022. So we have monthly and then quarterly labor statistics with more indicators, and for annual statistics, we have the most indicators breaking down until state and administrative districts and subnational level. For quarterly employment statistics, was sourced from mainly quarterly employment survey, with most recent statistics as of the first quarter of 2022. This is actually drawing from establishment approach. So another another angle of statistics that we produce besides using survey is actually combining multiple data sources to produce estimates. An instance of this is the production of labor productivity, which is produced every quarter, and graduate statistics, which at this point we have produced for annual statistics. So basically, these are some of the statistics that has been produced so far, either using single statistical source, which is survey or census, or by combining multiple sources. Now, can we move to the next slide? Despite the frequency and granularity, we had over time encountered various gaps, issues, and challenges, which is either raised by users and stakeholders or from our own analysis and estimation of these statistics. So I can actually explain some of the discrepancies between the statistics produced by the National Statistical Office and other administrative records are often observed in terms of approach of data collection. So basically, because we have census, survey, administrative data compilation, and big data analytics. And drawing back to the purpose of data collection, as Kiran had already mentioned just now, so it goes back to the reason the data is being produced. Usually for survey, we really want to actually estimate the statistics or measure, and then either for monitoring or enforcement purposes. And goes back to the population coverage, either individuals, households, establishment, employers, geographically, demographically. And in terms of frequency, we also encountered statistics which are produced monthly, quarterly, annual, and some of the statistics are almost real time. And then in terms of the reference period, we have lack of the reference period, which is a month ago, looking at mid-year population, end of calendar year, end of financial year, and finally goes back to concepts, definition, and classification, which can differ across different sources of data sets. Now, let me bring you to the actual data in the next slide. This is one of the experience that usually when we look at the data, we can actually identify based on current experience in the actual statistics as of the first quarter of 2022. We can see that number one, when we compare the job vacancies against unemployment, so the first column is actually looking at unemployment of 671.2 thousands in Malaysia as of quarter 1 2022, sorry. And then we have job vacancies based on which is 184.3 thousand. Now, another perspective is online job advertisement, which is 15.1 position. 15.1 thousand. There's an error there. 15.1 thousand positions advertised. So, going to another example is discrepancy between supply and demand. We have 16.2 million labor force, and then we have 8.57 million jobs. And in terms of employed persons, there's another error there. There are actually 15.2 million employed person, and then field jobs of 8.47 million. So basically, looking at this data, when we draw the conclusion, we can see the gap actually come from the different source of data collection. So labor force survey would report on the household approach, which cover individuals in private living quarters, and usually use household and face-to-face household approach through face-to-face and computer-assisted telephone interviewing, while another one is another survey, which is quarterly employment survey, which utilize establishment approach through e-survey and by phone and face-to-face interview, and the coverage is actually registered private sector establishment only. So you see, we found that when we produce this kind of statistics, these are among the questions that we faced, and we found that we were not able to answer these questions if we continue to report it as it is. So the third one is online job advertisements. Also advertised through online job portals advertisement, and coverage is only 4 common job portals used in Malaysia and which use big data analytic. So this is some of the gaps that could actually lead to misinterpretations if we are not able to explain the gap to the users. And then another example that I can share with you is in the next slide. Right, here, this is the statistics of salaries and wages and labor productivity per employment. So basically, we know that issues has been raised at a global level and at most regional level about the imbalance or disequilibrium between wages and productivity, whereby most countries quoted higher labor productivity as against the growth in salaries and wages. But because we are reporting from a different sources, and this can lead to misinterpretation if we did not manage to actually explain the coverage, because we found higher growth in salaries and wages compared to labor productivity, as if that employees in the country is not performing to their optimum capacity. But in actual fact, this is due to the different coverage and sources and approach used. Salaries and wages survey only refer to full-time private and public sector employees, and whereby labor productivity actually covers employment in all economic sectors, including own account workers, unpaid family workers, and also employers. So these are some of the gaps that we found while we analyzed, and also has been raised by our users. So basically, let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I just would like to share some of the motivations, or as Kieran put it, what problems are we trying to solve by trying to develop labor account for Malaysia. From the challenges that we've encountered, the main motivations to develop an account illustrating the linkages between labor market statistics are basically, firstly, to provide a link between the dimension of labor statistics in such a way that national account can actually balance income and production, whereby we can actually show these are the gaps between the data, and illustrate what are these gaps doing, and how can we identify and address the situation. So, and the second one is, as much as possible, we aspire to inform stakeholders and users into a more granular and higher frequency statistics or insights to what is happening based on labor statistics. And the third one is basically, when we have all this information, hopefully we can ensure a more targeted policy mechanism to address various issues, and can actually assist those most vulnerable, or that most required the assistance. So, and can we go to the next slide? Right. So, earlier on, the ILO had outlined the key elements of labor statistics, often drawing on the people, enterprises, income opportunity, and input provided. So basically, when we see this, as we review these elements, for Malaysia, we tried as much as possible to map them with the available data sources for the country, going beyond what we collect or publish in Department of Statistics. So instead of looking into the National Statistical Office per se, we try also to look at other data sources. So for employed persons and job, beyond labor force survey, quarterly employment survey, and labor productivity, there are actually administrative data sources that can actually provide a more comprehensive picture without doing the survey. And then unemployed and underemployed partly can be addressed through employment insurance statistics. Also, job vacancies besides quarterly employment survey, we have big data analytic through job market insights, and we also have My Future Job, which is an employment a public employment service portal which address the gaps between job seekers and job vacancies. So and then in terms of hours of work, this is quite tricky because this is only usually available through survey and also estimation of labor productivity. From income from employment and labor costs, we found besides the statistics, there are also estimation from national account and also from administrative data sources based on the contribution made by employees and employers for social security and employees provident fund. And so for organization of the labour market per se as a whole, we have Malaysia Statistical Business Register, Companies Commission of Malaysia, Social Security Organisation and Employees Provident Fund. So these are some of the things that we have already done to identify what are the data available. So next slide, please. Now, looking at this dimension, upon further breakdown of the statistics and attempt to close the gaps based on some of the challenges encountered in current labour statistics, we tried to cluster all these statistics into what is available by looking at the practice of the document of ILO, which is the paper Kieran shared in 2002, which I agreed is really still very relevant today. And also looking and drawing to the practice of ABS and the UN guides on these matters. So basically, these are what we work on. We put the elements into 4 quadrants, which is persons, jobs, payments, and volume. Now, statistics in thick black, which is labour force, employed and unemployed. These are some of the things that we are available already, but for underutilized, as we are still at this point, you partially adopting ICLS 19. We have not yet fully adopt ICLS 19. So we have partial indicators of underutilization. Mainly, we do not have information of those age more than 65. What we have is 15 to 64. So these are some of the challenges. As for jobs, the quadrant for jobs, most of all the 4 elements or indicators in the jobs quadrant are partially available. So we need to actually draw back into the identity equation and make sense of what we have and how we want to balance this. As for payments, we have compensation of employees, which is available, and for labour income from self-employed, it is partially available through household income and expenditure survey. So now, looking at the 4 dimensions which I has already mentioned, and assessing what we have in terms of the indicators, we are still mapping in terms of the coverage and frequency. For instance, we have some indicators up to the quarterly level, but some we only have every 2 years or 3 years. So we have to make some major decisions that which has to be made is whether or not these statistics that we assess as being available can be used, or we want to forego these indicators in the estimation. So at this point, we agreed upon a coverage of industrial classification with estimation by kind of economic activity at 2-digit disaggregation. However, in terms of reporting, perhaps we will not go as detailed as this. This is just for estimation. And for frequency, we are looking at annual data. Currently, we have already compiled the 2019 and 2020 with all the gaps and trying to to actually model the equation and balance the data. And then, yes, we are looking at cross-sectional data because these are easily available as compared to panel data. Right. So this is basically what we are doing at this point. Now, if I may go to the final slides. Right. So when we are doing this, as I shared just now, we encountered some of the challenges. Basically, one of them is in terms of the completeness. LFS covered most of the population but lacked the economic granularity. Therefore, we know that we can identify most things in the persons quadrant, but in terms of the accuracy of the what we identify for persons quadrant and to make sense and to make a coherent picture between persons and jobs would require some estimation, and so that we are still looking to explain the gaps in to explain to make sense of the differences. And also, as for payment components, we are largely missing other labor costs and can only utilize wage and income statistics. So this also would be some of the challenges that we are still trying to reconcile. Right. The second thing is for identification of equation and model. You see, some of the statistics are already published in other forms, in other publications. So to ensure the estimations in the labor account are in line with the trend of the released statistics. As I think Manpreet explained just now, we have to ensure that the account makes sense, as although it is a complementary it is trying to complement the other labor statistic, it still has to make sense and it cannot contradict the published statistics. And for balancings, we are trying to close the gaps for variable and sources which are not currently available through looking at administrative data sources. Now, as for way forward, in terms of the statistical estimation, we are trying to finalize the development of employment metric as a basis to move forward the development of persons and job quadrants for Malaysia. So we are going to focus on that, and and we will reconcile the person quadrant with the employment metric, and also to identify administrative data source as a complementary data source for payments quadrant. I would like to share one thing that is not in the slides, but when Kiran actually mentioned in relation with Labour Market Information System, LMIS, that is one also of the way forwards for Malaysia in developing the labour account. We are actually currently developing the labour market information analytic platform, which is actually trying to integrate various labour market data from administrative data sources in addition to the data source available from the National Statistical Office. So basically, in terms of collection, we have data from survey and census already, but we want to add in administrative data sources. This project has just kicked off on 1st June 2022, and it is planned or scheduled to be completed in 18 months, which is supposed to be next year. So in terms of data repository, this is actually a system. So we are trying to also, while we draw into developing the labor account, the labor market information analytic platform, the framework that we think upon to produce the statistics is actually based on the 4 quadrants of labor account as well. So, all right. So another way forward is actually while we are doing this, we are trying to communicate with users and stakeholders on the current gap in the labour statistics and the plan in terms of development of labour market information analytic platform and the framework of labour account in the development of labour market information analytic platform. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for very informative presentation. Malaysian's structure of statistics, household survey, establishment survey, and administrative data for labor market would be common in most countries. I understood gaps among those data are encouraging them to compile comprehensive statistics. I also understood communication with users and stakeholders would help address challenges. Now we move on to questions and answers. Considering time limitation, I will summarize questions received previously and in the chats, and allot each presenter to answer the question. So to the first speaker, to Ms. Kiran, two questions. One is from previously input. Use of innovations to create global platforms for review and evaluation and monitoring around the world and Asia. And the next question is, do you have a framework how to make an adjustment, or it's depend on NSO? Please answer those questions within 3 minutes, please.
Okay, well, I'll start with the second one, because that was a little bit clearer. I think this is actually the big point, is that now we hope that labour accounts will be included in the SNA, and that will provide clearer guidance on various steps, including the process of adjustment that you need to make. In the meantime, the best reference point is national practices like the ones in Australia and Malaysia, where you can see the types of adjustments that people make. For example, whether it's because two different sources give different numbers of vacancies or different unemployment estimates. So that's a quick answer to that. No, there isn't a agreed framework of adjustments, but good national practices are an important reference point. So I'd encourage people to engage more with them. The first one, I was a little bit unclear what the idea was. Is that in the chat? Can I, or what was the question? Could you repeat the question maybe?
Use of innovations to create global platforms for
Use of
review
innovations
and
to create global platforms. Okay, I mean, if I take that about global platforms to share practices, I think it's a good idea. It can often be challenging. It is something actually within the Department of Statistics in ILO. We're currently trying to develop a database of global practices across various fronts, including, for example, the types of practices people have for their labour force surveys. So I certainly think it's a good idea, but I also know it's challenging, because you need to have a mechanism to get information on country practices across all countries, which is it's a very good thing to do, but it takes a lot of work, because we also know many NSOs and many other agencies, they receive a lot of requests for information from international organizations. So it's a certain amount you can gather by searching the web and populate it yourself, but inevitably you often end up having to ask for information, and that creates burden on the NSOs as well. So but it's something we're looking to do more of, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To Manpreet, one question is the frequency of comparison of statistics, and related to that, can labor accounts serve all major users' needs under insufficient frequency of data. Related to that, we received one question, what best practice that are suitable for each regional government must do to synchronize between market labor to the needs of enterprise. So frequency and the needs are highlighted in those questions. Would you answer to those questions?
Yep, thanks for that. I might start with the question on the frequency, the high frequency one. I think from the three presentations today, it's come very clear that the labor account is actually something that is actually very valuable in terms of providing insights for not only government but for other stakeholders in terms of what's happening in the labor market. So definitely, there is a value add in having a labor account. In terms of the frequency, given the disparate availability of data, I think this question can maybe looked at it slightly differently, and I'll put it in that context is that you don't need to have a quarterly labor account to get all the answers. Like as I mentioned in my presentation, Australia started by having an annual labor account first, and once we actually worked with our users to understand how it can be used as part of their standard models, we then started looking at developing a quarterly one. So what I would say is, in terms of the frequency question, is to say, one way to address this could be to produce an annual account, which allows for final level of data to be available. Alongside, you could produce more frequent quarterly data account, more quarterly account with less data available. Which is the approach that the ABS has taken. And I think, this allows the best of both worlds in that the users that want to have it on a quarterly basis or more frequent can get that data. But those that want a lot of detail, a lot of information, that can be balanced by having an annual one where you can have final level of data available and you're less tied in terms of some of the confidentiality or robustness issues. So I think this question can be looked at it from a different angle in terms of you can meet the needs of your users, but it's being very clear of what that is through both having an annual and a quarterly. The one thing I will mention is by having both a quarterly and annual labor account, it does pose some challenges in terms of ensuring coherence between having a quarterly account and an annual outputs. So just be mindful, if you do go down the path of having a quarterly labor account and annual, you do have to think about the coherence between your quarterlies and your annual data, and how do you reconcile the differences? So I think that's a very important question. And can I just ask if you could repeat the second question, please?
Second question is, can labor account serve all major users' needs under insufficient frequency with data?
Yep. And what was the first one? Sorry, I answered the first question. Sorry about that. So what was the first question?
What best practice that's suitable for each regional government must do to synchronize between market labor to the needs of enterprise?
I think there's not a single bullet that can answer that question. It all depends on the data sets that are available that allows you to actually compile the labor account. And in terms of trying to align both the household and the business, it comes down to the national context. For example, in the Australia's case, in developing the labor account, the total count of filled jobs is always held to the household side, which is the labor force survey. So you basically assume that the total count that is coming from the labor force survey is actually spot on. The levels per industry is taken from the business survey source, which then allows us to make sure that when we're looking at the industry proportioning, we are able to do that using the business source as our key. So when you're looking at, say, for example, job data by industry by quarter, that's manually processed by the team to ensure that the data is coherent and clerical adjustments are made. So I would say that there's not a single answer. but the key thing is to ensure that you understand your inputs and between the supply side and the demand side, and then you're able to make the relevant decisions about how to balance and and ensuring that there is coherency. And the other point I'll mention, which was I think mentioned in the chat room, is the way the Australian labour account has been developed. Any adjustments that we make to the jobs quadrant or focus area, flows through all the other focus groups or quadrants. And the interesting part is that if you are starting to publish different quadrants or focus areas at different times, it will create a big challenge in producing and maintaining a coherent story across the 4 focus areas or quadrants and provide a coherent narrative around what's happening in the labour market. So I think this was one of the questions in the chat room. So I just wanted to flag that having a labour account on different frequencies when all the 4 quadrants are intertwined will create additional challenges, and it will also muddle up your coherent picture that the users and government are really keen on understanding. So I think it will introduce additional unnecessary burden on not only the statistical office that is compiling the accounts, but it will make it a lot more difficult for the users to actually interpret and understand what the data is showing. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. With the time limitation, we will conclude today's Stats Cafe. But before that, finally, please allow me to introduce a training course, Labor Count, Introductory e-learning course. The course was organized in 2021 as a facilitated course with the lecturer, Mr. Manpreet Singh, today's speaker, and now can be accessed freely as a self-learning course from a learning management system. This course is designed to create a foundation on labor count. The course materials was compiled with help from our colleagues in Statistics Division of ESCAP, especially Ms. Rikke Munch-Hansen and Mr. Arik Nayasuru. Thank you very much for your support. Now let's conclude today's Stats Cafe. I hope today's cafe will lead to start or develop labor counts in your country. Thank you very much, excellent speakers and audiences. Also, I appreciate Secretariat's incessant service from Statistics Division of ESCAP, especially Ms. Ratana Durangrapran, for continuous monitoring accessibility and inputs in the chat. Last but not least, I'd like to show great appreciation to my colleague, Ms. Pinarucha, who's spearheaded the cafe, planned the agenda, and coordinated the speakers. She's always underpinning today's cafe, even now, regardless of her own labor account. Thank you all. Have a nice rest of the week, and I am looking forward to seeing you in the next Stats Cafe.